fucking nigga since the fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
I'm going to rob you because I don't have enough, and I'm gonna take yours. Okay? Okay, I'm coming.
What I hate the most about this is this just vindicates all the people who are like, Juice is my favorite host.
No, I'm coming for you. You specifically, listening now on the sofa. Open your wallet.
Open your wallet and donate to the Gumroad.
Oh, and to the Gumroad. Judas wants a pizza. He can be pleased if you buy him not a pizza. No, John says he hates pizza. No, say a roast.
It's funny that you just explained in great detail why you're probably not excited for that movie, The Whale, with Brendan Fraser.
Why? I thought it was just about a fat gay man. Why would I be excited about that?
Because that's your brother.
Oh, fuck. Yeah, is the movie about like a weird fat neat?
Yeah. It's just like a guy
okay.
who's morbidly obese and he's gay. And the story, he's got like a week left to live, and then he tries to reconcile with his daughter, his estranged daughter.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to watch that. That's fucked up.
That is, it's your brother.
Yeah.
Even kind of looks, because once you get that fat, you could only wear a navy blue t-shirt.
Yeah.
There's no other shirt you can wear. It's big, just and that
Absolutely.
specific color.
And like sweatpants, and you have to have a buzz cut because you can't like clean your hair because your arms don't go that far back.
I'm worried that she's forgotten what an amazing person she is.
I need to know that she's gonna have a decent life where she cares about people and that she's gonna be okay. I need to know that I have done one thing right with my life.
And then I'm sure it is emotionally tortuous. I bet it's a tearjerker. I bet there's some Oscar-worthy scenes. But this really is a movie that you or I could have written, where it's building up to the big Brendan Fraser, very commanding performance, where he just goes, I'm so fat because I'm gay.
If that scene is in the movie, I will watch it. That would probably be my all-time favorite film.
And it'll get clipped and you will cry, but that's pulled right from this show. That's as close as you're going to get to us making a movie.
Yeah.
What if a huge fat retard was also gay? Nominated for 7 Academy Awards.
Fat gay retard.
Okay, well, what happens? He dies.
He cries a lot, and nothing works out for him, and then he's dead.
And then, is there anyone else in it? I don't know, a fucking Chinese bitch.
Damn, I want to see this movie now.
Okay, we're gonna watch the movie for the show. I guess there was something I wanted to end on. It was a book I read recently. All right, I'm back. Sorry, I gotta walk all the way upstairs to get to my library to get these books, and I'm doing this downstairs now. So it's this book on the topic of phenomenology, which we discussed with Tyler Hamilton when we had him on for an interview, which everyone can find on our Odyssey channel. And there's a link to the full episode in that clip. It'll be on YouTube as well, I believe. But phenomenology, I didn't know much about it. I think he did a pretty good job explaining it, but I wanted to get deeper into it because I didn't really know what it was. But it's a very interesting sort of metaphysical, philosophical study about how it's very, very high level about how knowledge becomes knowledge and how the universe is structured objectively and subjectively. So I got this book. He recommended this book because there's so much out there on this topic. And I didn't want to become an expert on it, but I just wanted to get the gist, explain it to me, in a way that I can understand. So I got this book called Husserl's Phenomenology by Dan Zahavi. That's a weird word. So it's about this guy named Edmund Husserl, Husserl. It's either Husserl or Husserl. He was born in 1859. So this is a pretty old book. It's about and it's explaining this guy's entire body of work. So I'm not going to be reading from one specific thing written by this person who was a pioneer of phenomenology. Not the only guy who talked about phenomenology, but one of the first ones. And some other people developed it later. But this guy was notable for being a mentor and a teacher of Martin Heidegger.
The seeds of phenomenology can be traced back to the 18th century and Immanuel Kant's distinction between the noumenal world of things in themselves and the phenomenal world of reality as experienced through our senses. This thread was picked up in the early 19th century by Hegel, but the birth of phenomenology as a philosophical school dates to the works of German philosopher Edmund Husserl in the last decade of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century. His formulation of phenomenology was taken up by a circle of followers at several universities in Germany, but the real heir to phenomenology's throne was undoubtedly Husserl's star student Martin Heidegger, whose 1928 work Being and Time was a defining moment in 20th century philosophy.
So if you're into Heidegger at all, you'll probably see a more advanced version of what is discussed here. But I thought this was a good place to start to really lay down the groundwork of what this thing is. So the reason I bring it up is because I found it very, very interesting for a few reasons. So I'll start by just kind of giving the broad strokes of what it is. What the fuck is phenomenology even? So the way it's described in the book, and I'm going to be quoting from the book at various points, but in short, it was phenomenology is about figuring out what knowledge is and how we can interface with this world of concepts beyond just the material. So there's some people who look at the world just in a materialist way. Scientists often look at it this way, that there's nothing spiritual about it, there's nothing abstract, it's just atoms and elements, and this thing called the human mind is something that can be replicated, and it's gizmos and gadgets and forces. But if you're a philosopher, you get into sort of metaphysical and ontological areas, but what is being? What do we know how to build a chair, but there's this thing called the concept of a chair, which can exist in the abstract. And when something exists in the abstract, does it exist more or less than something in the real world? Things like that. Like you get into sort of categories and symbols. This is stuff that's been discussed since Plato. These are very, very old questions that keep getting reformulated, but it's saying that, the real world, the reality we inhabit isn't just this materialist thing where everything that is spiritual is just incidental and made up. Now, this is what, a lot of Marxists might believe. Like, they try and do away with all this stuff. They see it's a waste of time. And a lot of liberals think this too, that all of that is trivial. The only thing that matters is individual material stuff, because that's the only thing that's real. So they'll define materialism as only the thing that's real. But phenomenology dares to say that maybe this is all interconnected.
Following the Cartesian principle, outer reality is a separate and distinct entity that can only be understood in rational terms through cognitive processes of deduction. Sense perception was thought to distort this process, and certainly emotions were considered a lower form of experience emanating from the recesses of the body. In contrast, phenomenology seeks to understand the outside world as it is interpreted by and through human consciousness.
And what's interesting is about some people will look at this and say, oh, it's kind of spiritual. Not really. That's the point. Phenomenology isn't spiritual. It's not even metaphysical. You can get there. You can get to these like higher level, weird metaphysical things. But this is very, very basic. It's not trying to replace any religion or anything. It's just trying to say that, concepts of things are just as real as the things themselves represented in the world. So anyway, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. But I think you kind of need to build the boundaries around what this is. So it says there's two central assumptions that phenomenology seeks to change. And that's the existence of a disassociated mind experience and a theory-independent world. Now, what does that mean? So one thing he's trying to fight, and this is kind of what we got at with the Society of Mind as well. There's this thing that liberals, I shouldn't just lay this at liberals, but a lot of materialists and a lot of individualists and liberals think, where it's like, I have a mind and my mind is just in my body, and the mind is just like a operating system with which I see the world. And in fact, everything is just subjective. There might not even be a world. It's just the representations that exist in my mind. And he says, like, no, that's not it. In fact, it's actually the opposite, that you observing the world has just as an effect on that world as the world does on you, and that the subject and the object are like intertwined in this sort of like interplay. So he's trying to fight that, like, you're a casual observer in the world. He's like, no. By observing, you are a part of the world. So there's that. Then there's also a theory independent world, that we can kind of like make up these concepts that can exist outside of the world. Like, there's the world, and then there's how we describe the world, and our concepts kind of exist outside of it as like a framework. It's like, no. It's like the concepts themselves are part of reality. Basically, everything's intertwined. Everything are like interrelated phenomena. And there's no way for anyone to stand outside of reality, just like you cannot stand outside of yourself. And that's kind of where we got out with the Society of Mind by Marvin Minsky. Like, what is the human mind? Some people think it's like this free floating spirit just like occupying your skull. But it's not really. Like, your mind is interconnected with your nervous system. You would not have your mind, or your mind would be radically different if you didn't have a nervous system, if you didn't have sight or sound, you know what I mean? So it's arguable that you would not have a human mind if you didn't have gravity. If you existed in zero gravity, your entire contextual framework would be so different, you might not even be human anymore. The point being that everything's always interconnected, and you can't stand really outside yourself. And that there's not, and also the fact he was fighting against this sort of this metaphysical idea where it's like, there's like the real world, and then there's like a hidden world that we can access, you know, that we only see 10% of the world, but there's the secret world behind everything, or there's a secret truth behind everything. He's like, there's no behind. Everything is what it is. Everything is the way you see it. Sometimes you can't see things with total complexity of how they are, but he's like, there's this idea that there's the truth we see, then the hidden truth of how the world works. He's like, no, like, it's all related, and there's no like hidden world to break into. There's just levels of complexity to our world that we can't really see, which is kind of different. Whereas a lot of philosophers are like trying to get to what they describe as hidden truth. He's like, that doesn't really exist.
So on the one hand, we've got the Cartesian approach, which assumes that the outside world has a correct meaning, which we then process slightly imperfectly, whereas the phenomenological approach suggests that the two are in actual fact combined, and that our interpretation of the world around us is part of what the world around us actually means.
And he comes at this in a very interesting way, and he kind of comes at it with like, what is knowledge? It sounds like a basic question, but that's really at the core of this whole thing, which is like, okay, like, how do you know something? How do you know something? Like, how can you ascertain that, like, I'm sitting next to a plant? I can look at it, I can ascertain that there's a plant there, but what is a plant? What is the concept or the category of the plant? And this is an old philosophical question about categories of things, but it's also like how our mind builds conceptual networks. Like, these attributes form a plant. But then this concept of a plant is like a separate thing. There's the amalgamation of atoms and everything, but then there's the concept of the plant. And what's interesting is he describes later in the book, and he makes the claim that if he uses the example of like a blue notebook. He says, here's the thing. When you imagine that blue notebook, you imagining that blue notebook is exactly as real as you looking and seeing that blue notebook. It exists just as much in your mind with the exact same levels of detail as it does in the real world, because both of those instances are like appealing to one central like category of that thing. There's an essence to that thing, something transcendent. And that's what comes back to the word transcendence. And so that's kind of what phenomenology is about. It's like trying to get to the transcendent things, that like, what is a thing? Like, how do we, we talked this before. I always give the example of the chair. Like, okay, what is a chair? Well, it's something you sit on. Well, you can sit on a rock. what is a chair? It's like, well, I guess it's okay. It got 4 legs and a seat. Well, it's like, does it have to have a back? Sometimes, like, but you eventually get to this sort of transcendent description of like the eternal chair. Like, what is this concept of a chair? It's something that you can sit on that is designed by a human being, and it's made of some kind of material, some hard material. And it has to have these specific functions, but that thing exists as a real category that can either manifest itself in your mind or in the real world. But both of those are kind of the exact same reality. Is anything I'm saying making sense, or what do you think?
Yeah, that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and like he likens it to numbers. He likens it to logic. So when you get into philosophy like this, you get into logic, and by logic I mean real logic, where logic it exists in the abstract. Logic it's the if-then statements, it's following presuppositions, following how things fit together. And in mathematics is the same thing. And none of these things exist. Numbers don't exist, but yet mathematics exists. Yet these quantities it can exist in the abstract, and the very fact that we can like mathematically model things in our mind and then transfer it in the real world, though they kind of exist abstractly on the paper as well, as a concept, as a model for something that you will build later. So he's like, that's why logic is not really an empirical science, and anything like that doesn't necessarily need to be concerned with anything that exists in the real world. You could have logic problems that are real, but they don't map onto anything that's actually happening in the real world, which is kind of an interesting way of looking at it. And then logic, of course, is extremely important to everything we want to do in the world. So is mathematics. But like I said, it all comes back to that pure essence. And he's fighting against phenomenology is against, he calls it psychologism. And like I had said, where some people think that their mind is just the spirit existing in their skull, he's trying to push back against that, which is sort of this epistemology that says everything is built on senses and grounded in psychology. And there's a lot of people here look at that politically, and they instinctually don't like it. They don't like this idea that everything is subjective. That's kind of what he's pushing back against. Like the people who say that everything's subjective, everything's just how you look at it. Every person out there has their own way of looking at the world, and well, that's not right. We might have slightly different interpretations, but we are all engaging with the same things at the same time. But to believe that, you have to believe that there is like a core essence to certain things. So he's pushing back against this, which was at the time when he was coming up very popular. Psychology was becoming a big thing, and all these psychologists were saying like, the human mind, everyone's different, everyone's special. So he's trying to say like, no, everyone's not that special. You can't be. You can't have a reality if everyone has their own reality. So everyone has to, at some level, have this sort of same shared reality. So what he says is he's basically saying that, some people think that when we see an object, like a plant beside me right now, we're creating a hologram of it in our mind. And that he's saying that's not actually what we're doing, which I think also ties into the Society of Mind by Marvin Minsky. It's like, your mind isn't really... Because if you remember that clip, we're saying like, it's not that our mind is just a recorder that records things and we processes it. What we do in our mind, if you'll recall, is that we create archetypes in our mind. Over the course of our developmental years, we kind of have this sort of amalgamation of data that says this is a plant, this is a chair, this is a tree, this is mom, this is dad. And we don't actually record everything. We autocomplete things. So the way our minds work actually is we create these sort of models and reuse them again and again and again. But our mind can work so accurately because it creates these symbolic models about everything. So he wasn't talking about this at the time when he wrote this, but essentially, I think that's how you get back. That's the shared tissue between these two things, that, we're not creating holograms in our mind. We are internalizing these like symbols and descriptions on a very high level, abstract level. And that's how we build our mind. So it's almost like we build our mind in a phenomenological way. And that's something that I think artificial intelligence people, they don't know how to describe that, or they'll describe it in a different way. When I was reading this, I just kept seeing all these links to how in the modern era we try and build human consciousness, and we see how it actually builds with these shortcuts and these reference points, and it builds things contextually. But if on one hand you have an artificial intelligence guy saying everything is contextual, and that's essentially what phenomenology is. Everything is contextual. Nothing exists separate from anything else. There is no mind that is separate from your body. There is no you that is separate from the universe. You can never stand outside of reality. And we think we do that when we make concepts to describe reality, but those concepts they exist within reality, and those concepts are just as real as anything else in the materialist world. I know this is kind of sounding pretty trippy, but does any of this make sense so far?
For once, I'm kind of losing you, actually. It is very, like, top level. I don't know.
You got a part here, just to kind of circle back to something I was saying before. He's got this line here, because we have to get going soon, I'm sure. But he says, consequently, it is important not to overlook the ethical dimension to Husserl's thinking. Husserl speaks of an evidence-based, self-responsible life that the phenomenological search for the transcendental foundation makes possible. To live in the phenomenological attitude is not a neutral, impersonal occupation, but a praxis of decisive personal and existential significance. In other words, philosophy is closely linked to an ethical life. So that's where you get to when you realize everything is connected, that you cannot separate, like this is what materialists and Marxists try and do. They try and separate, like, here's real life and here's the spiritual life. That's not real. So phenomenological look at it is like, no, they're actually all interlinked and connected and respond to each other. And what I liked about this, aside from all the technical stuff, was it's anti-fragmentation. It's trying to segment reality into different parts. Like, here's the human. We're separate from everything else. And the mind separate from everything else. And certain things, to say that this is the arrogance of a lot of intellectuals now, where they'll say, like, I found the important 10% of reality. The other 90% is unimportant. That's what modern scientism says. It's like, we found the stuff here. All that other shit doesn't matter. That's an insane way to look at things if you really think about it. But we still do that. We still try to make these claims that, the thing I'm interested in, I think that's the real truth, and all this other truth doesn't matter. And it's not trying to find a hint truth. It's realizing that reality is extremely complex, and all your job is to try and look at it for what it is and understand that complexity, and realize that you can't really reduce anything like that, because that's anti-nature in a sense. And again, he does this without getting into spirituality or philosophy. He has no time for that. He's just saying, like, look, all I'm trying to do is figure out how the world works. I think it's all relevant. I think my relationship, when I look at something, there's an interplay happening. When I, Dimes, look at this Christmas tree in front of me, what am I doing? Am I creating a hologram of it in my mind? No, but there's some essence of this thing called a Christmas tree, and we're having a transaction right now where, like, I'm kind of accepting it into my mind. I'm not duplicating it. I'm not, like, building it again in my mind from just witnessing it. I'm interfacing with this sort of transcendent idea of a Christmas tree, because there's such an idea as a Christmas tree that I made real, or we all made real as people, just as real as a regular tree. But this Christmas tree is distinct from a regular tree. And me trying to, like, every time I look at this and realize that it's there, I'm participating in this. I understand this is getting kind of trippy and redundant, but the transcendental idea of this thing called a Christmas tree exists, and it doesn't exist beyond reality. It doesn't exist like in some platonic form in the background. It is what it is, but everything is real. That's really the core, the underlined message here is that everything is real. There's not things that are more real or less real than anything else. The concept of the Christmas tree is, when I imagine in my mind, it's about as real as the Christmas tree that's standing in front of me. And that's how he comes about it. That's really, I think, the essence.
I kind of get that. I kind of see what you're saying. Like everything at every level is kind of interrelated. And if you can describe it or interact with it in any way at all, it is real, and you cannot. It's real, and now that it's real, you can't separate it from anything else. That you can draw a line from that platonic tree through the tree in your living room, through into your head and your understanding of it, and it's all. Yeah, okay. I kind of get it.
Yeah, he's got this line in here that I liked, and this will sound weird to some people, but I would be remiss if I didn't say it, where he says, it is possible to imagine a worldless subject. And when he describes subject, he basically means a subject is anything that you think is relevant or important, like a subject of me, whatever it is I'm looking at is the subject. He's like, you can imagine a worldless subject, but you can't imagine a subjectless world. And I imagine that it's like, you can't imagine a world without this stuff, but we can kind of imagine just the stuff without the world. But that's really the core of it, that we can imagine this thing of a Christmas tree sitting in a void. Now that's an interesting thing. The fact that we can do that is interesting. And the fact that, and we circle back to like, this is what knowledge is. What do you mean? What do we mean knowledge? That I can abstractly know what a Christmas tree is and not only file that away in my memory, but also pull it forth as this thing in my mind to understand it as some entity without seeing it, hearing it, smelling it, tasting it, whatever it is. Like it can still exist as like this transcendental entity. I think that's the power of what he's trying to do. Like, so the entire idea that we can know things almost implies that this is real. That's what he would say. So, and that's why the very first question is like, what the fuck is knowledge? What do you mean? What is it to know something? And something that can live in a memory. That's kind of, I think if hopefully that makes sense to people, because if I fail at this, I'm going to have Tyler Hamilton doing a bunch of fucking karate on my skull.
He's coming for you.
He is. He might have done a better job. I can't even remember. I don't remember this fucking show. And just to reiterate again, so Immanuel Kant, who we never really talked about on the show, I read a bunch of Kant before, we never really covered it. There's this thing that Kant talks about, something being a priori. And a priori is like the most stripped down version of what that thing is. Like, how do we know? It's kind of like this. It's similar to this, where it says, how do you know something exists once you strip away all sensory information? Like, how would we know that certain things exist if you couldn't see it or hear it or whatever? So
the opposite of empirical knowledge is a priori knowledge. It's knowledge that isn't justified by appeal to the senses. So, for example, think of the truth that all roses are roses. That's a pretty boring truth because it doesn't tell us very much, but it's true. And you know it's true without having to rely on your senses at all, because it's just true by definition. So since that truth isn't justified by appeal to the senses, it's a priori. But Kant also thinks math is a priori. So for example, you don't have to do any experiments to confirm, for example, that 7 plus 5 equals 12. Kant thinks we ultimately justify that truth without appealing to our senses at all. So it's an example of a priori knowledge. Now Kant thinks a priori knowledge has a couple of really special characteristics. First, it's necessary. We don't think that 7 plus 5 just contingently turns out to equal 12. And it's not an accident that 7 plus 5 equals 12. We think it's not possible for 7 plus 5 to equal anything other than 12. In that sense, 7 plus 5 necessarily equals 12. And Kant thinks the same goes for all a priori knowledge. Second, a priori knowledge is universal. That is, a priori truths like 7 plus 5 equals 12 are true without exception. There's no time and there's no place where 7 plus 5 doesn't equal 12.
What he says in the book is that's not really what this is. Like, it doesn't even go that deep. Something like that is built off of something like this. A lot of other epistemological or ontological stuff is built off of this shit, but this is just like, I'm not trying to get that deep into it. I'm just trying to say, instead of trying to strip things down, I'm just trying to view things as they are. irrespective of any other ideological stuff. And that's what I found so interesting about it. He's coming at more, he's not even ideological about it, it seems. But there's a quote from Merleau, someone who came in the wake of Husserl named Merleau-Ponty, who is arguably a more famous and more relevant phenomenologist. But he is quoted as saying that the world is inseparable from the subject. Being and consciousness are separate but united within the transcendental subjectivity. So, like, we understand that there is a difference between me as the observer and the rest of the world, but that they are more intertwined than you just being sort of this separate agent. He has a line here that will probably sound very confusing, but I'm just going to say it just to fuck people. It says, phenomenology is the becoming of the world in the self-constitution of the transcendental subject. I'll say that's 5 times fast.
Ho-ho.
All right, so I'll leave it at that because I think I got the main stuff I wanted to there. But the reason I wanted to bring that up is because I thought it welded very well onto the discussion we had in the Society of Mind and how we went into detail about how the mind builds its archetypes and builds its conceptual framework and how the mind actually is intertwined with everything else in the body. And it rang so true that reading this,
I could see that. Like, Minsky's talking about it from a very almost a technical standpoint. Like, he's essentially a programmer saying that you can't have a mind and observation and opinion without a physical body and a connection and lungs and a heart. And this is a very, very, like, a tactile way of understanding it, but this is a more metaphysical way of saying, like, no, those things from the standpoint of, like, knowledge and reality and existence are actually intertwined and cannot be separated. So they definitely are two agreeable topics.
Yes. All right. Well, everyone, thank you for bearing with me on that. I know that, and whenever we do our philosophy stuff, I know some people don't like that, but I think it's important for the concepts we're going to be building going forward. I just wanted to give phenomenology, and it's day in the spotlight on good old fashioned blood.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.